I'm Zara Kesson, the Chief Executive of CSIA, and I will be moderating the panel for today. Many boards are still grappling with the integration of climate change and climate governance into their strategic planning. In today's webinar, our panel will be exploring some of the issues, the key issues that boards and company secretaries should know about climate change. As a strategic advisor to the board, the corporate secretary needs to guide the boards on how they can view climate governance and climate change as a strategic challenge and an opportunity rather than a compliance requirement. And also we will have a look at how we can avoid fiduciary failures on climate discussions. So the topics that we will be looking at for today is the impact of climate change on economies, business, and also industries. We look at some of the challenges that businesses have in implementing climate action and also how they can integrate it into their transition plans and their goals. We look at the risks that's involved in climate change and sustainability agendas, and also the opportunities that can be integrated into business models. Then also quite important is to look at the legal implications of organizations who may fail to implement climate action or fail to meet their targets, and also have a little look at greenwashing and greenwashing, some terms that have recently come to light. Finally, we will have a look at what is the role of digitalization in enabling sustainability initiatives. We are very pleased today to be hosting this webinar with our partner, Convene. So I'd like to now invite Convene Africa's Chief Executive Officer, Ibrahim Hanslow, to introduce us to Convene. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to this webinar. As the Head of Sales and Marketing, it is my privilege to represent Azaya Systems, which has been at the forefront of the digital transformation and governance for more than 30 years. Today, we are both delighted and proud to collaborate once again with Corporate Secretaries International Association Limited, or better known as CSIA, to bring you this webinar series. This is the second year we're partnering with CSI to help organizations and corporate secretaries improve their corporate governance practice and educating them with the latest governance updates, trends, and practices. At Azaya Systems, we are committed to providing our clients with innovative digital corporate governance solutions that meet their specific needs. Our mission is to empower businesses by leveraging the technology to improve the efficiency, productivity, and profitability to align with the governance. We are a global companies with offices in Asia, Europe, Africa, North America, and delivering the highest quality IT solutions to leading organizations worldwide. Some of those organizations are also Fortune 500 companies. Since 2003, we've been appraised at the highest level, which is level capability, maturity, model integration, excellence, and its dedication to providing the best technology solutions to our clients. At the Azaya Systems, we take great pride in our commitment to digital governance and customer satisfaction. Our seasoned team is dedicated to ensuring that our clients receive the best possible support, service, as well as the software. Our flagship product, which is Convene, is a comprehensive board management software. It is, if you can think of it, taking your boardroom on a digital journey. The software design is to optimize the entire board meeting experience. Convene offers a range of advanced features and functionalities that makes the management of your boardrooms and your board meetings a breeze. Convene's user-friendly interface allows for a seamless meeting preparation, documentation, distribution, collaboration amongst participants and board members. The software is highly secure, employing advanced encryption, user authentication, data protection measurements, and to ensure that your confidential data is secure and protected at all times. Convene is an essential tool for future-fit companies and that want to streamline the board meeting process and to improve the decision-making capabilities. It is an ideal solution for modern business and professionals that value mobility, efficiency, security, as well as flexibility. So without further ado, I'd like to thank you for your time to attend this webinar, and we hope that there is sufficient value and learnings that is going to come out of this for you today. Over to you, Zara.
Thank you so much, Ibi, for the comprehensive introduction to Convene. CSI has also been using Convene since July 2020, and we've been very happily partnering with them on promoting good governance practices in corporate secretarial, corporate governance, and compliance services. And now, before I introduce our panelists,
over to you.
Thank you, Ibi, for your introduction. And before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to just share a quick introduction to CSIA.
Global events such as corporate failures, the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and political and economic volatility left a devastating impact on the global economy and caused a significant shift in the corporate governance landscape. The changes these events have caused in market dynamics have presented new challenges and increased complexity to the governance responsibilities of boards. Boards face intense scrutiny of their governance practices and increased pressure for new governance models to drive resilience, sustainable value creation, and the protection of stakeholder interests. What is the Corporate Associate Programme? The Corporate Associate Programme at CSIA provides the opportunity for organisations to join a network of corporations who have demonstrated their commitment to good corporate governance.
As the global voice of corporate secretaries and governance professionals, CSIA connects corporates, governments, and governance professionals to share knowledge and research to address the governance trends that threaten organization sustainability. Our webinars have explored the implications of digitalization in the boardroom and the impact of the pandemic on corporate governance, as well as highlighting the evolving role of the corporate secretary in driving effective climate governance and leading the transformation of corporate governance. At CSIA, we are building a network of organizations and governance professionals that are committed to promoting good corporate governance practices that will redefine the governance landscape and shape the future of governance.
Together, we can reaffirm the business world as responsible corporate citizens and restore the public trust in the governance system.
So for today's discussion, we want to share some insights and also some experiences from our panelists. And this is to help the corporate secretaries to guide their boards in terms of climate action and also climate governance. So let's start with some of the facts. It is widely known that our climate is in crisis. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their sixth assessment report, indicates that we've already warmed the planet by 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. And global greenhouse gas emissions between 2010 and 2019 were higher than in any previous decade in human history. The magic number to avoid the worst impacts of climate change is 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think by now that's a number that everybody is quite familiar with. And governments across the world have signed the Paris Agreement to try to limit this warming to 1.5 degrees. To do this, however, emissions must be reduced by 43% by 2030, and that's just 7 years away. And the World Meteorological Organization estimates that there is a 50-50 chance of reaching this goal in the next 5 years. In addition, between now and 2100, the financial losses arising from climate change could run from $4.2 trillion to as much as $43 trillion. And this number is deeply concerning when considering that the total global stock of manageable assets is worth $143 trillion. Now, the good news is that there are countries that are implementing affordable, clean and green energy solutions. And in today's webinar, we will be talking to our panel of experts from different industries and also jurisdictions, and they'll be sharing their experiences and challenges on how they've implemented climate action. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce you to our distinguished panelists. The first panelist joining us today is Ms. Wayini Ngia. She's the Head of Legal and Compliance and Company Secretary at Bamburi Cement PLC and its Kenyan subsidiaries. Our next panelist is Dr. Serena Ismail. Dr. Serena is the Group Head of Sustainability at the IOI Group in Malaysia. Our third panelist is Ms. Jack Lee Liu. She's the Head of Sustainability Strategy at the Bank of China in Hong Kong, which covers 9 Southeast Asia countries. Also joining us today is Ms. Tracy Davies. Tracy is the Executive Director at Just Share, a non-profit shareholder activism organization that advocates for corporate South Africa to use its financial and social power to drive urgent action to combat climate change and reduce inequality. And our fifth speaker today is Segun Vashist. He's the founder and CEO of Computer Revolution Uganda and InnoServe IT Africa Limited. So a very warm welcome to our panelists. So for today's event, we will start with an interview with Paul Geyer, which has been pre-recorded as the time difference doesn't allow him to join us in person. We will then move on to the panel discussion on the topics that we will be covering today, and also getting insights from panelists on their experiences. After we complete the discussion on these topics, we will then have an open forum where we will be able to take questions from the audience for specific panelists or for the group at large. And once that is complete, we will have closing remarks to wrap up the session. So let's dive in with Paul now, and he will kickstart the discussion on the impact of climate change on economies, business, and industries. We are delighted to be talking to Paul Geyer today, who's joining us from Australia. Paul is an experienced chair and non-executive director recognized for his strategic thinking and business development skills. Paul has 25 years of executive experience with 12 as a CEO, and he spent 10 years with the Australian Institute of Company Directors, developing unique skills to assist boards. He's currently an independent chair of Wamiria Development Association, Winemakers of Rutherglen, Gowrie, Victoria, and a director of VUCA Trusted Advisors and Australian Dental Council and Assessment Committee member. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Zara. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for joining us. Okay, I'm going to jump right in, Paul. And with Australia's exports ranging from agricultural produce such as beef, and also being amongst the world's biggest exporters of coal, iron ore, and gas, the economy has a strong link to the environment and the natural resources that it uses from the environment. Australia has also seen an increase in both the frequency and the severity of many extreme weather events. There's been records of bushfires, floods, and also warnings to Australians to prepare for more extreme weather as further global warming is expected over the next 20 years. Can you perhaps tell us how has climate change impacted on the Australian economy?
Look, Zara, I think the most striking thing is the economic impact of the bushfires across eastern Australia last year. That was a $5 billion impact. And then the recent floods were also $5 billion of economic impact. So those two events alone were really significant. The climate weather events are so striking that, as you can see in that slide, the Australian Treasury included in the government budget papers the impact of insurance costs for our weather events. But this is not all the weather events. So, for example, it talks about floods in New South Wales, but it doesn't actually include the floods in Victoria or the Western Australian bushfires. And so at a macro level, we can see across the Australian economy the significant impact that climate-induced weather events are having, and of course are predicted to increase.
That sounds like it had quite a devastating impact. I think the other issue, of course, is that Australia is one of the third, or is the third biggest fossil fuel export in the world. And coal is also the second biggest export for Australia. And 2 years ago, Australia's 2030 emissions target was half of that of the US and the UK. Has that changed in the meantime? And how is the government reacting to the risks that this is posing to the economy?
Well, governments, like businesses, face risks as well. And so the political risks associated with climate change came out in the last election, where we saw a significant shift in the electorate's concern about climate change and essentially voting out the previous government for not actually having strong enough emissions targets. So one of the first pieces of legislation that was enacted by the new government was to actually enact the Climate Change Act, which set in place 2030 and 2050 targets, essentially aligned to the Paris Agreement. So we have a 43% target for emissions reduction by 2030 now. So quite a significant shift in Australian politics. And underlying this, those physical risks that I talked about before, about $5 billion worth of impact from bushfires and floods, that's driving consumer sentiment. That in turn is driving political change, and now we're seeing regulatory change in response. Alongside the Climate Change Act, we've just recently, as of a week ago, had what's called the Safeguard Mechanism Amendment Bill changed. This is committing the 215 largest carbon dioxide emitters in Australia to an annual 4.9% reduction in emissions. Now, there is government support for them to do that, but we now have the biggest emitters on a trajectory of reducing emissions. But the pace of regulatory change is also moving. So the budget included funding for the Australian Accounting Standards Board to implement changes to the reporting standard, but also for the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, which is the regulatory agency for financial institutions, that's banks and insurance companies, for both to require those organisations to report on their emissions reduction targets, their emissions plans, as well as their climate risks. And so that's really broadening out the scope of organisations that are going to be compelled to act on emissions reduction. But I think the most interesting one is what I'd say something that's very under the radar in Australia is the New South Wales Environment Protection Authority. Its remit has now been extended to recognise greenhouse gases as a pollutant. The consequence of that is they're now engaging with 50,000 businesses in New South Wales to discuss their emissions reduction plans. But more broadly, the New South Wales Environment Protection Agency has also spoken to every other state's Environment Protection Agency, because New South Wales is concerned about businesses just shifting their operations to another state that has a lower requirement. So what we'll see over time is we'll see all the states step up and recognise greenhouse gases pollutants and include them in the Environment Protection Act. So the remit's going to be so much more broader.
That is indeed very encouraging, Paul. I'm really happy to hear that Australia is no longer the bad guy.
No longer the
when it
bad
comes
guy.
to that.
Working on changing.
And what about businesses? They are quite critical in the fight against climate change. And obviously, as you've noted, there's now legislation that will compel them to reduce emissions, which is a great step. But what are the risks that they face, and what do they need to consider in order to manage these risks?
Look, I think the beginning point to answer your question, Zara, is the pace of change has been quite slow. And so we have very few certified net zero organisations in Australia, and even at the ASX 200 level of the sort of domestic ASX 200 companies, really 40 odd % have only started working on their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we've got a long way to go. The regulatory change is going to force change into the future. But I think businesses can't ignore the physical risks that relate to climate change. The insurance data across the world is really compelling for the future of physical risks. And what's going to happen is businesses are going to see their supply chains impacted by weather events. Their physical operations are also going to be impacted, and their staff will be impacted. I mean, it's something as simple as major floods stopping people getting to work. I've got it's probably a strange example, but I've got a friend from a farm in central New South Wales who's got a picture of 3 4-wheel drive tractors bogged in a row, all trying to rescue one tractor.
Wow.
And then, it's a really small thing, but it shows you these weather events and the physical impacts they have on businesses are very real, very tangible. I think also alongside that, for any organisation moving into emissions reduction, there's transition risks. We will see changes in consumption patterns as consumers move. We'll see changes to access to markets. So as an example of that, the Singaporean government's starting to flag that they will include emissions in their contracting and with their suppliers. And the US government's going to do the same thing. So we'll see changes to market access. We'll also see changes in costs and productivity as organisations starting investing in lower emissions production processes and energy. But of course, we're going to see more climate regulation. That's just inevitable, I believe.
Indeed. And organisations are very aware of that, and I think most of them are preparing for that. There are obviously areas where they are going to be a little bit, they will be trying to avoid litigation by setting targets that they may not be able to reach. So there are definitely going to be transitionary aspects that they're going to have to consider in this period. But ultimately, as you say, this is going to have to happen. They don't have a choice. So how do they actually integrate this transition into their strategies?
Just to respond to how you started on that question, Zara, I think we've moved from greenwashing, where you're concerned about litigation risk, to green hushing, where you don't disclose what your targets are so you don't get caught up in any litigation. I think the two extremes are really ethically not sound.
Indeed.
But governments will force, through regulation, people to actually have transparent and reportable targets that are consistent over time. You'll see that sort of language about consistency and transparency is going to be caught up in accounting standards and other regulatory changes. So I think the days of greenwashing and green hushing, I think we'll move on from that very quickly. But to sort of answer your question around strategy, in terms of emissions reduction, I think the first thing boards should be very clear about is actually setting the strategy for the organisation before their executives rush in and start doing baseline emissions targets. And the really big picture questions boards should be thinking about are, given the drivers for emissions reduction, what will our sector look like in 10 years' time? And how do we respond to these changes and what our sector will look like? And how can we identify opportunities within those changes? How will we manage climate-related risks? And how quickly should we move on emissions? But I think in terms of whether it's a workshop or a discussion around the board table, I mean, the issues that you'd want to see a board think about are, what's the vision? What's the purpose of our emissions reduction? Is it about emissions reduction or is it about sustainability more broadly? What's the scope? Again, is it about emissions or is it about water, water reduction or water management? So how broad do we want to target this? What are the priorities? So really related to the purpose, are our priorities meeting regulatory requirements? Are our priorities reducing our energy costs? Or are our priorities about the opportunities that we can see because we can see what this sector will look like in 10 years' time and we want to be a first mover? What targets will we set? What are the risks we face, both physical and transition risks? Will we allow the executive to offset, or do we want to drive emissions down? So thinking very clearly about offsetting versus emissions. What's our reporting internally and externally? And who are our stakeholders that we really need to engage with? Our clients, our employees, our investors, or the broader community that our operations physically exist in? I mean, who do we need to engage with? So I think there are some really important questions that the board should be answering before their executive teams start the work of doing baseline audits.
Well, that sounds like a sound approach. I
think just to add to that, I think when you start sort of giving examples like this, it starts to demonstrate that the scope of change is significant. And it's important for boards and executive teams to not be naive about the level of change that could be required in their organisations, because they need to slow down and actually plan for this. I mean, do they actually have enough capacity to address an emissions target that the board sets? Will they achieve that target? Because if they don't, there's litigation risks. So they need to be thorough.
I think that's the dilemma that most boards are actually grappling with at the moment. Is how do they manage that situation? So when it comes to, and you've spoken about the scale and the scope for organizations, and obviously depending on how big or how small the organizations are, that will define how they, or determine how they decide on a governance model. What kind of approach should they take in making this decision?
Sorry, Zara, I understood your question, approaching the governance model.
Yeah, in deciding how they're going to manage the governance of emissions reduction, what kind of approaches can they consider?
I think the first consideration is whether or not your organisation is of a large enough scale and that the scope of implementation required warrants setting up a separate sustainability committee of the board. You can, of course, run emissions reduction and sustainability within your current governance processes. And whether or not you have a sustainability committee or not, your audit and risk committee will pick up a lot of work. And so, as some really simple examples, your risk register will need to change and your risk tolerance statements will need to change, because I think you need to consider whether or not, if you've set a target of, say, 50% reduction in your emissions by 2030, what does a risk tolerance statement look around that, and do you need one? And so you need a committee that actually is going to have oversight of your emissions compliance obligations, your emissions reporting, but also the audit and risk committee is going to need to approve the emissions reduction targets, plans, and budgets. Just really straightforward, classic work of an audit committee. But the other aspect that is really important is to understand what the assurance framework around emissions reduction is. Do you need external certification Or is there enough confidence in the work that's being done internally to trust the reporting? And that, of course, relates to your compliance obligations and your stakeholder expectations. So, you know, the Audit and Risk Committee will need to think about assurance quite clearly. Then, I mean, one of my sort of personal views is if you've got a people and culture committee, you need to think about employee engagement. Employees are going to drive the change, and their sentiment towards emissions reductions is going to be very important for driving change. But you also need to think about how you align remunerations and bonuses towards hitting emissions targets, and whether or not you need to make some significant changes in that area. And lastly, of course, you know, a governance committee, which is going to affect company secretaries straight away. A governance committee is going to have oversight of all these committees and all the changes to their terms of reference, the scope of their work plans. The governance committee is going to have to ensure that there is a holistic view of how emissions reduction is governed in the organisation.
I think, as with most of the board's duties, you know, one of the first ones is to set the tone at the top, as you said. But it does have to cascade down into the whole organisation. If everybody doesn't play their part, and if that culture isn't embedded in the organisation, it is going to make that task much more difficult. That's absolutely
I think
right.
Measuring employee culture or engagement around sustainability is important, because I think it gives the board a bit of a signal on greenwashing. If your staff don't believe the implementation plans or the targets, it's a bit of a sign that you might not reach them and you're at risk of litigation for not achieving them. And so I think employee sentiment's a really important signal of how the organisation is performing.
So you mentioned in your article and also earlier on that there has been little progress by companies for emission reduction. And of course, as we mentioned, it can be a cost issue, it can be fear of litigation, transitional risks, but there are also opportunities. It's always the flip side, well, mostly the flip side of risk. And if businesses don't move fast enough, you know, they may not actually get the advantage. So are there any drivers for business to make that decision, to commit?
I think there are 5 drivers for organisations to think about emissions reduction: customers, employee engagement, access to capital, scope 3 emissions, and regulatory change are sort of the 5 that I would consider. I think I've got a couple of favourites in here. I think customers is one that really strikes me. No matter what survey you look at, you'll get somewhere between a 60 and 80% consumer support for more environmentally sound products and services. It's really strong. It will fluctuate with severe weather events, but it is really so strong and it's locked in. There's a great study from Yale which shows that in America, only 9% of people are true skeptics who don't believe in climate change. But the segment of the population that is alarmed is about 30%, but that's doubling. In 4 years, the size of the alarm sector or segment of the American population has doubled in size. So in 4 years, you've got a rapid change in concern. That's going to translate into consumers' purchasing habits. So if your organisation can take the risk of losing 20% of your customers, don't act. But I don't think most organisations could withstand losing so much of their customer base. And then a very similar way to the customers, your employees have very similar views. But employees also have a bigger picture or intrinsic motivation. Employees are happier working in organisations that are environmentally sound. And in the fight for talent, that's probably an easy one to put forward to increase your employee value proposition by actually being a more sustainable organisation and communicating that to potential employees. I think the biggest one that's going to surprise people is scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are emissions in your supply chain. And it's how this cascades and compounds down through the economy. So if you pick a supermarket selling bakery products, they will have Scope 3 emissions. They will talk to the businesses of supplying bread. In turn, those businesses will talk to their flour and grain purchasing companies. And in turn, those organisations will start talking to grain growers. And there you have a cascade effect through the supply chain down to farmers, with organisations all the way through setting expectations for emissions reductions. And you see this compounding effect through the economy because one listed company is driving change in its Scope 3 emissions. And I think that's going to cause quite rapid change in the next 5 years across the Australian economy and across economies in the world. And I think regulatory change is pretty straightforward, but there are a couple of recent ones that I think will start really catching people by surprise. You know, the International Accounting Standard Board has just started discussing changes to international accounting standards. That's just at the discussion point. So in the next 5 years, we'll see much more widespread, I'm assuming that's what will happen, we'll see much more widespread changes in accounting standards that will affect companies all across the world. And my last point in this slide is individually, your organisation will be impacted by one of these 5 changes, or these 5 changes in varying ways. But it's the interaction of the 5. And so as customers see more organisations acting on emissions reduction, their attitudes will change. And so their expectations around companies will change. So Scope 3 emissions will play into consumer sentiment. So it's this interaction, cumulative impact and compounding impact across these 5 drivers that are going to really speed up change in the economy and in society more generally. But for businesses, aside from these 5, you've got opportunities around resource efficiency, energy sources, access to new markets, new products, new services, and organisational resilience. And there are first mover advantages. And to give you a really good example of that, green steel is currently attracting a 20 to 30% margin. Now that's really significant. So the first movers have access to profit margins that the laggards will never access. So the first movers will get the profit, the return, to cover their investment costs. The laggards won't get that because the market will shake out and smooth the prices out. And so the sooner you act, the sooner you take on the opportunities, the greater profits you will gain. Now, there's risks with taking that on, but I think the risks are greater for those who don't act because you won't make any money at all. And lastly, the effort's worth it. The evidence base is pretty strong. The companies with higher ESG ratings outperform other businesses by a factor of at least 10%. It's the quantitative analysts in the investment banks know this absolutely. And so they create investment funds around ESG and sustainability and emissions reduction because these are higher performing companies.
So there's definitely a lot of compelling reasons for organizations to go this route. In fact, I think they very soon won't have much of a choice. But when it comes to the board and the leadership at the board, who's going to really drive this process?
Look, I think company secretaries have to take on a significant leadership role. I think keeping your board informed of the regulatory change is really important because it's so fast moving across the globe. And so if you're not identifying those regulatory changes that are being discussed or actually signed off, your board won't be fully informed about the pace of change that they need to adapt to. Clearly, as I've already touched on strategy, you want to prompt the chair and the CEO to include emissions reduction in your strategy discussions. And clearly you need to do it in your risk plan. So whether you've got a chief risk officer or an audit and risk committee, the company secretary's got to be pushing for some of these things to be discussed by driving the work plans of those committees and driving the agendas to create the space for discussing what will be changes that are going to come their way. So I think the role here to drive this is going to be really putting leadership pressure on company secretaries to step up and drive change in their organisations, because as I've already touched on, when you look at the governance side, it's across all the governance aspects of the organisation that they'll have to think about where emissions and sustainability fits and how they adapt governance to respond to these changes.
Paul, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. I think it is important for us to have our audience get a global perspective of what is currently happening. This is something that affects every single continent on the planet, and everybody has to work together. So we do have to share our knowledge, and thank you very much for sharing that, your insights with us and your knowledge with us. And I hope that we will be able to speak to you again soon on these matters as they unfold. Our thanks to Paul for sharing his insights and also this Australian experience with us. It is really encouraging to see how the governments are stepping up and gearing up to address climate change, and also assisting organizations in both ways, the carrot and the stick, by providing funding, but also the regulatory change. Also interesting to see the influence of the consumer in driving both political and regulatory changes regarding climate change. And as Paul mentioned, even the consumer is also one of the key commercial drivers for businesses. So clearly has quite a critical role to play. I think another insight for me was that businesses are looking at what their purpose of the organization is when considering how they're going to integrate climate action and climate governance into their strategic plans. But let's find out from our panelists and how this has impacted on their organizations, because it is clear that everywhere in the world, we are all affected by the effects of climate change and extreme events. So I'm going to start off the discussion with Wayne, where Kenya has actually experienced erratic weather patterns in the recent years, and there's been droughts, and these droughts have been followed by floods. And according to the 2018 Kenya Bureau of Statistics, the country loses between 2 and 2.4% of its gross domestic product annually due to the effects of climate change. What impact has this climate change had on the manufacturing and construction industry, and what risks did the industry face? And also, how did Bamburi Cement mitigate these risks?
Thank you, Zara. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, from wherever you are. As you know, Bamburi Cement is, and for those who may not know, Bamburi Cement is through its name, cement manufacturing company. So we pride ourselves on providing cement and other building solutions. Now, of course, the production of cement requires quite a number of things which are impacted by climate change. So in our country, in Kenya, there has been quite a bit of an extended drought. And this has run for a couple of years. So the adverse weather patterns have not been the friendliest for business. So in our industry, we've actually faced a number of challenges, and those include the scarcity of certain resources, which are raw materials that go into the production process. So, for example, we use alternative fuels like biomass, and these are things like rice husks that we use in our processes. The rice husks come, just as you are, from the rice that we eat. So this is the waste from the rice that we eat. unfortunately, when you have adverse climate, you also have low production. So this has been impacted, and we have had to look for alternative ways to source biomass and alternative fuels. Additionally, we have had scarcity of water. So in one of our, in Mombasa, where we have a plant, we also have a conservancy for wildlife. And this is something that we have kept, it's called the Bamburi Hala Park. For those who visit Kenya, I would encourage you to come and see it. This is a rehabilitated quarry, and the rehabilitation extends to the entire ecosystem. So what we did was not just planting trees, but created an entire ecosystem with wildlife, species of birds. Some are endangered, some are recognized globally. And what has happened is that when you have drought situation and water scarcity, you now have to actively look out for these animals. So you have to feed them, you have to buy feeds, and you have to take care of them. So this is one of those things that as a responsible corporate, we've actually had to go through. In terms of water, I will say cement by itself, of course, its generation, its production, as well as other products that we make, the precast products, these are the molds, the concrete, they require water. We are now looking at innovation into how we can use less water in our operations because of the scarcity of this resource. And we're talking about clean, available water. So these are just some of the challenges we are facing in our industry. And of course, I don't think we are alone in this. Quite a number of industries are facing them. In terms of how we have dealt with it, I think this is something we will talk slightly a little later, but resource utilization is what springs to mind. I think we have had to review how we use these precious resources, look into it, challenge ourselves. Can we use less and still do more, or do equivalent of what we were doing? And for our alternative fuels, we've had to look at various things. So I will speak about those a little later, but I think, Zara, I think I briefly captured what we have gone through.
Thanks so much for that, Wayne. Just you've spoken about some of your challenges and mitigating some of the risks, but you've also had to set very clear commitments and targets for your 2030 plan. How challenging was that to develop your sustainability framework? What did you have to consider when you developed that framework?
Yes, so Holcim, which is the parent company of Bamburi, and Bamburi itself has made commitments on net zero. And the company would like to be net zero, hopefully by 2050. And this in itself is no mean challenge. So it means we completely have to reorganize everything that we do and embed sustainability in all our operations. So it means that we are looking at scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. So scope 1, cement is the manufacturing of cement contributes between 5 to 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. So this is a big challenge for us. And it means a major investment. So we are discussing at what point would the business be able to invest in something like this? What would we be able to do to have a carbon capture plant? These are discussions that are going on. Are we ready? When would we be ready? Would it be 10 years from now? And then we're building those frameworks. Additionally, there are many things you can do in the operations now to make them a little more sustainable. So for example, we use clinker in our operations. The production of clinker is actually one of the greater producers of scope 1 emissions, and we've had to substitute some of those clinker as raw material to something else that has lower emissions on the journey. So for us, I would say that part of the biggest consideration has been the cost of the investment that we need to make and the planning of that governance, even as you make these announcements and pronouncements that you will be net zero or you will reduce by 30, 20, 40% by a certain period, is embedding those targets in your milestones per year. So that I think has been one of the biggest challenges. to embed those sustainability frameworks. The other challenge that people don't talk about is, and I think Paul alluded to it, is the amount of involvement of the entire team that you need to do on a daily basis to deliver a sustainability framework. So this is not something that you wake up today and you decide, oh, we're doing it tomorrow, let's start it. This is something you plan for, and you have every area of your business being impacted. So you look at your scope 1, this is your entire plant, this is your production, you still have to deliver your targets, but you have to ensure you're walking that journey towards a more sustainable business. So I would say that the cost, the time involvement, and the sheer planning of it is a bit of a challenge. For us, we are fortunate because we've had, our company has been in existence for 70 years. We also have a whole team who has been in existence for much longer. So we've been on this journey for quite a while, but you can literally see the struggle in the industry for those who are looking to move that journey. So that's one challenge. There's also a lack of awareness. So there's a lot of awareness to be created into what it means to be more sustainable and to reduce your emissions. That I think that is a long journey we will be walking with boards, with our stakeholders, with our shareholders. Many people still think that it's enough to plant 10 trees. It's not enough. The trees are not going to do it. We need to do more. So
this is clearly a journey that is probably going to be ongoing for a while. So thanks for sharing that with us. And now looking maybe at the side of the government and what they are facing, and turning to South Africa, that has been facing an energy crisis for nearly 2 decades, actually going back as far as 2007. Tracy, in your article, which is called South Africa's Two-Phase Energy Transition, you referenced 2 keynote speeches. One is from the Minister of Transport and one from the Chair of the World Coal Association, which was actually supported by the Mineral Resources and Energy Minister. And I quote, you said 2 not only different, but completely incompatible visions for the just transition to a low carbon future. Both visions were supported by the government. So this consistently inconsistent messaging from the cabinet is a key reason for South Africa's infuriating inability to address its energy crisis. Has there been any change in the conversation about energy from the South African government?
Thanks, Zara, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. As you point out, it's actually more than 2 decades ago, the South African government was warned in no uncertain terms that significant investment would be needed to manage energy demand, and that our country's aging and very poorly maintained fleet of coal-fired power stations were not going to be able to do the job. What's happened over the past 2 decades is a very long and frustrating story, but essentially those warnings were ignored. And as you referenced, since kind of 2007, 2008, we've known that those predictions are absolutely correct. And Eskom, South Africa's state-owned power utility, has had to implement what it euphemistically calls load shedding, which is essentially rolling blackouts on a schedule across the country in order to manage demand. And since then, a combination of poor governance, corruption, and vested interests in the coal industry have really meant that the situation has become worse. And last year was South Africa's worst ever year for load shedding in terms of number of hours of load shedding across the year. 2023 is looking like it's going to be even worse. In addition, until fairly recently, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, there was really very little meaningful recognition at a government level of the risks of climate change, to the risks that climate change poses to our people and to our economy, and very little understanding of the opportunities posed by a shift to a low carbon energy system. But that has changed, and over the past 2 years, a number of important developments have taken place, including President Ramaphosa's convening of a presidential climate commission, a cabinet-approved integrated resources plan, which has clear targets for closing down those old coal-fired power stations, a cabinet-approved national infrastructure plan, which has clear targets for rolling out renewables, an energy action plan, which includes approvals for 30 gigawatts of renewable energy in South Africa, a cabinet-approved nationally determined contribution to global climate change agreements. The most recent budget speech by our Minister of Finance envisages no future investments in generation and a shift towards investing in transmission, and a cabinet-approved Just Energy Transition Plan that envisages an investment program of 1.5 trillion rand over the next 5 years, and which is due to kick off with an $8.5 billion package from foreign donors announced at COP26. So that all sounds great, and like lots of progress has been made, but it's not quite that simple, because we're also dealing with massive vested interests in a very corrupt coal industry. The recently resigned CEO of Eskom gave an interview just prior to leaving the utility where he implicated at least one cabinet minister in corruption at Eskom coal-fired power stations. We have a Minister of Energy who's an unapologetic advocate of increased use of coal far into the future and is championing oil and gas exploration. He's also an extremely powerful ally of the president, and in a recent cabinet reshuffle where everyone anticipated that he would be removed from his post because of his active role in preventing renewable energy deployment and a move away from coal. What the president did instead was appoint a brand new Minister of Electricity. And no one knew at the time quite what his role would be, but there was some levels of optimism that we now had a minister focused on ending load shedding in South Africa. Unfortunately, in recent weeks, though, it's been clear that either he doesn't understand the energy crisis, this new Minister of Electricity, or has been deployed as some kind of distraction, because after touring the country's coal-fired power plants last week, this new minister gave a press conference at which he advocated that significant new funds should be invested in maintaining and upgrading our coal-fired power stations, most of which, by the way, have long since passed the point at which they should have been retired. And this came in a week of all sorts of other extraordinary policy flip-flops and a significant increase in load shedding. We're now on stage 5 or stage 6 load shedding, which means 10 to 12 hours of blackouts a day. And these pronouncements from the energy minister fly in the face of all the commitments and policy changes that I listed above. So if we'd had this webinar a month ago, I would have been able to say with a fair amount of confidence that we were making some significant progress. But after the last few weeks, unfortunately, it looks like we're back in a state of turmoil. And of course, from a business confidence point of view, that is a disaster for local companies in terms of planning, as well as managing load shedding and the impacts it has on their operations and their profitability. But also from a foreign investment point of view, we are really seriously sending out the wrong signals as a country.
Thanks, Tracy. So we have the action plans, the commitments, and we also clearly have a very devastating impact on the economy, but there doesn't seem to be much political will to actually change or implement the plans, I think is the message that's coming across from you. So on the one hand, we have governments that are actually influenced by consumer sentiment. And then on the other hand, we have these the political will that actually becomes, that actually stops anything from happening because of the vested interests and the corruption. Let's move on then to Jack in Hong Kong. And still on the coal situation and energy, China has also been cited as the largest coal consumer, accounting for about 49% of the world's total coal in comparison with the next largest, which is the United States. And their coal consumption has increased by more than 2.3 billion tons over the last 10 years. So as coal is widely used for power generation, and there is 1.4 billion people in China, 7 million in Hong Kong. Has there been any new legislation that's been passed to curb this dependence on coal and find any alternative solutions?
Yeah, thank you, Zara. So let me try to break down the questions into two different parts. So it's factually accurate that China is actually the largest coal consumer, consuming about 49% of the world's total coal consumptions as compared to United States. As you correctly pointed out, that two countries are they have very different size of populations. One is 1.4 billion, United States about 350 million. So comparing absolute number might skew the picture a little bit as well. So this is one. The second point that I would like to raise is that two countries are at very different stage of economic development. China, as we all know, that is the manufacturing hub of the world, and economic development more often than not comes with a certain level. Energy consumption is essential to economic development. So what China has been doing is for the legislation front for their climate goal that they have actually announced back in 2020, they have actually used the intensity ratios in terms of carbon intensity and energy intensity. Before going to intensity, just one statistics that I quite like, because if you look at the total consumption, China is obviously without a doubt the biggest, because the population is just the most populous country in the world. The energy consumption is inevitably is going to be large, but per capita wise, if we divide by the population, China energy and carbon dioxide intensity, it's about half of the United States. So China stands at 7.61, and I think United States is about 15 per person, 15 metric tons per capita. So that tells you that if China were to develop, continue to develop their economic growth going forward, the more mature point would probably be what the OECDs and the United States, the average consumption per person, so it'll be double of that. But when we look at the intensity ratio, taking into account the population size of the country and the economic activity, the two metrics that they are now using, it's energy intensity and carbon dioxide intensity. So they basically divide this by the GDP per GDP, as well as to make sure that it's comparable. So to make sure that their carbon or the climate goal that they have announced can be achieved without jeopardizing the economic developments and the power supply to the people. So how it has worked out is that I'll share with you the number. So what they have done, the coal consumption for China for the last decade has actually come down in terms of the total energy consumptions. The proportion of it has actually come down from a high of 68% to about 50% now, 52%, and they are actually quite confident that it's going to go down to 50%. And they have also set very clear renewable energy share of renewable energy to their total energy consumptions. So I think they stand at about 18 to 20%, and they would like to raise it to 25% going forward. So this is their 2030 and 2025 goals. They are very clear goals that has been set. So in terms of whether this goals are, or this KPI is what we call it in Chinese administrative government, how they do it is they publicly announce this, and a lot of these targets, the two carbon intensity and energy intensity specifically, they are binding targets. That means that all those KPIs will be trickled down from the national level to the provincial level to make sure that the measures are duly implemented, while balancing the power disruption so that the load shedding, what Tracy shared earlier, hopefully might not happen. But it did happen in August last year because of the sudden cuts, because of the heat wave in certain part of China, and there's a certain disruptions of the distribution channel of the electricity grids. So with that, they actually act fairly quickly to actually address this, because it's quite hard to imagine so many people living. I myself live in the 50th floor of a building. If the lift stopped working, I can't go to work. There's nothing I can do. I cannot do anything. So a lot of the livelihood of the people have actually been affected by that. So this actually raised the challenges for the people and for the government to actually realize the importance of making sure renewable energy is in place before they actually take away this. At the same time, you can see the energy intensity as I mentioned earlier, divided by GDP per capita, has actually been one of the fastest declining rate in the world. So for an average GDP growth of about 6.5% for the last decade, their energy intensity, it's not growing at a 1-to-1 ratio. It's growing at much slower growth. It's 3%. This is against at the back of it is supported by the measure that they have actually done. The new legislations, quite a number of them have been issued. The renewable energy law was issued back in 2005, and they have been revised and revised over the years. And it covers a wide range of solar, wind, you name it, they've got it. So, and a lot of incentive and also safeguarding measures have been introduced in this framework and outline, and a lot of them have already been implemented. That's why we see the share of renewable energy has actually been progressively edging up, and they're actually on track to meet well, we expect them to be on track to meet their national decline NDC commitments in the 2030 of 25%. So renewable energy share has been going up, even though the total coal consumption has been increasing because the economy still have to grow. They can't just win it off immediately, but there's a clear timeline, there's a clear plan for it. As what Tracy mentioned earlier, some of the fire plants, it's slightly different scenarios. Some of the coal-fired plants in China, it's has been upgraded. It's new, so the efficiency of it is actually a lot higher. So that's why when they look at the intensity ratio and how efficient the energy structure or compared to the value that it brings to the people is actually a little bit longer. So this is one of the strategy that they have actually implemented to balance the almost impossible balancing between power supply to people, making sure people can get to work, making sure people don't get stuck, while also making progress and meaningful progress in their climate goal. So the renewable energy front, China, with the renewable law that they have announced in 2005 and constantly revising it, they are actually the world's largest investor for wind, solar, and quite a number of different energies. And in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, they actually invested about 546 billion. They are the top of the world in terms of the investment. The second one would be it's 4 times of United States, 141 billion before the Inflation Reduction Act just kicked in. And European Union was 180 billion. So you can see how determined China is into developing the solar and the wind energy. And there are very clear areas that have been marked to develop the solar and the wind energy. So this is the new legislations, and we are seeing that more and more impact of it. It's coming to our life, and as we can see, the proportions of the coal consumption has been on the steadily decline rate. There are very clear caps that have been, or absolute number that have been issued by different province, different government, and a lot of them have to answer to this. There's mechanisms for these companies to actually report this to the government on a regular basis. So there are very clear measures that they have been trying to do this to implement something of such scale in a 1.4 billion country population. So I think the road ahead will not be a smooth sailing one. As we can see, the geopolitical crisis have Germany restarting their coal-fired plants to try to make sure the winter is okay. I don't think it will be a straight, linear projections of the past, but it will be a challenging one. But I think based on what they have achieved now, it's rather encouraging. That's how I personally see it. So these are the new legislations that actually comes out over the last few decades. I think in the last 2 years, I lost like what Paul mentioned earlier. The speed of the new regulations that's coming out is just, it's mind-boggling.
It is, and I think it's just going to get faster with the reporting standards also coming out. But so the journey is obviously going to be a bit of a slower one, but it's very encouraging to see that the legislative changes are happening. From the financial sector perspective, how does this influence your, obviously there's sustainable funding that's coming from the banks. How does that legislation influence your operations?
We have actually, it has a humongous impact for the financial sectors because the government and I think everyone's also realized the gap between what the public sector can do and the NGOs can do, and versus without the private sector participating, it's just impossible. The gap for the financing gap is simply too large. For what BOC Hong Kong that we're doing is that we are also trying to play as a leading commercial bank in Hong Kong. We are also trying to play our part in the sustainability strategy. What we have done is we have a sustainability committee. We have a sustainability committee to coordinate the strategy between Hong Kong and the nine countries that we have operations in. So the top tone at the top, it's very clear, and we have a 5-year plans to make sure that this has that it's a clear action and plan and quantitative target for us to actually move forward. Scope 3 is obviously one of the key things that we are all working on. So the financial center, we are not alone in this, because if you come to Hong Kong, most of the banks are actually doing this, because the back of it, or the highest level of it, Hong Kong MA or the regulators are very, very actively pushing forward the agenda and trying to reallocate more private capital to support the financing needs for this green companies, especially Hong Kong as an international financing hub. So what we have seen is that the China finance market actually topped the world charts in terms of the green bond market, which is the most mature product or most visible product that we can see in the capital market here. And Hong Kong, for the 6 consecutive years, it's one of the largest, it is the largest bond Asia, what we call outside investment bond listings destinations for a lot of the companies intending to raise funds from the capital markets to fund their own corporate strategies. So from the supply side, we see a lot of corporates who are coming to Hong Kong to actually ask to get funding. And also from the investor side, we are also seeing international investors from all over the world coming to Hong Kong and looking for good green and sustainable finance projects to actually finance. So this is the supply and demand side in Hong Kong. On top of the private sector that are actively doing, what we have seen, at least for BNC Hong Kong, our customers wise, our sustainability linked loan, which is one of the products that we offer that is linked to the performance of the corporate, and our green loans have seen, I think, more than 1.5 times increase in 2022, which is very encouraging. The appetite is very high. And our deposit funds, those have also recorded a very good opening rate, I think 31% increase in 2022 as well. For the government while, so they also have a lot of incentive to help the financing of this private corporates. So the government has actually listened to the government and listened to the market and asked, what does the market need from the government? So a lot of the corporates actually feedback to say that there will be additional costs in issuing green bonds or green loans. So as a part of the measure to actually answer to the market's demands for it and to encourage more take-up rate, Hong Kong government actually launched a government green bond grant scheme to offer subsidies for or incentivize the corporates from reallocating, upgrading their machinery, upgrading their manufacturing plants, and providing certain subsidies for them to do this. So this has, in 2021, has been widened up or expanded to cover more loans as well. So from the overarching framework, the government is encouraging it and giving very tangible subsidies for the corporates. Everyone asks, so what can I get out of it? How I would like to upgrade my plants, but I need the funding and I have no extra costs. Who's going to bear this extra cost? So in the banking sectors in Hong Kong, together with the regulator and the government, actually work together to try to see how we can public and private cooperate in a different manner, more efficient communications to channel what the market expects, what the market needs to move towards greener, decarbonized future. That's what we're trying to do now. So the overall impact for the banking sector or the finance sector in Hong Kong has been very, very positive, I would say.
That's very, very encouraging to hear. But it's clear that organizations really do have a lot of aspects that they need to consider before they can decide what approach they're going to take, what governance structures they're going to have, and how they're going to integrate climate governance into their strategies. So, Dr. Serena, in Malaysia, IOI Group has been quite a front runner when it comes to sustainability, and you've actually been on this journey for quite a long time. Can you maybe share with us how you integrated or developed your sustainability framework and how you've integrated that into your strategic planning?
Thank you, Zara. First of all, thank you, CSIA, for inviting IOI to share our journey forward in climate change action initiative. I thought to give context, let's see, it's not moving. To give context, it's okay, yes, to give context, I think it's important to talk a little bit about IOI Corporation. We are a leading global integrated and sustainable palm oil group with both upstream, we have our plantation, we are the growers, and as well as downstream operations. We are doing manufacturing in terms of oleochemicals and refineries. We have a global presence in 8 countries, but we are mainly headquartered in Malaysia. We are a member of the Roundtable Sustainable Palm Oil organization, as well as part of the mandatory scheme for palm oil, the Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil Certification. So most of our estates and our mills and refineries are actually certified. Now, in context of the fact that we are present in Malaysia, we are an agricultural company, so I thought maybe it's important to also highlight the climate change issues and in Malaysia. So in Malaysia, for example, we have an unconditional target to cut the carbon intensity against GDP by 45%. By 2030, this is our NDC commitment. And Malaysia has also committed to halt deforestation by 2030 and maintain a 50% terrestrial area under forest cover. Currently, I think it's about 54%, so we are still on target. And to reduce methane emission by 30% compared with the 2020 levels by 2030. We also set a goal to reach carbon neutrality by early 2050. Even despite this, we have also a lot of issues regarding rising sea levels and temperatures. And as you are probably aware, we had a lot of issues with flood in the past couple of months. We are now slowing down and now going towards more likely El Nino instead of La Nina. And so now we'll be probably facing issues related to high temperatures and droughts. So IOI is an agricultural company, and therefore climate change is existential towards our operation, our business operation. And therefore we in 2019 introduced a climate change action initiative. And the pledge is to make sure that we are being sustainable. We take actions on any of the issues raised. We make known the issues that are being addressed and are being addressed sustainably. One of the issues that we wanted to make sure that we are not accused of is greenwashing. So we have pledged to be transparent about key decisions and reasons behind what we are doing, and our issues are not being swept aside. And this is very important to us in terms of disclosure. Engagement, as the previous speakers have stated. It's really important. It's important to listen to our stakeholders, not just to our customers, but to our community, to investors, to regulators. So, and to make sure that, we hear their arguments and their demands. NGOs have been very, very much looking at what climate action has impacted the communities. And therefore, this is really important for us to also look into what are the demands that are being made before we make any key decisions. I think it's really important that governance sits at the top of any kind of initiatives. And this is a part of our pledge of being no greenwashing. So in 2020, we had decided to be aligned with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD. And the first pillar of TCFD is governance. And prior to this, IOI has always had a Group Sustainable Steering Committee. And this Group Sustainable Steering Committee, or GSSC, have on board our Group Sustainable Group CEO and Managing Director as the chairman, and the presence of one of our independent non-executive director being present in the Group Sustainable Steering Committee. And therefore, what you can see is that the direct interaction of one of our board members, who is also part of the founders of the Climate Governance Malaysia, CGM, and brings to her brings into this board her expertise on regulations and what governs climate change. And we have, for example, at this board level, at this the sustainable strategies, the priorities, and the targets. We have, for example, the strategic management of the material sustainability matters being driven by the group head of sustainability, because this is at the execution level, and all the relevant senior management. This means department heads, division heads that are involved in implementing climate change. And as this is a whole company's effort, you can see that this permeates all throughout, from the top all the way to the bottom. And in terms of making sure that we are very much involved in the financial impact of climate change, we have formed a working group for the Climate Change Action Initiative, where we track and document financial investments required that is involved in any project related to the reduction or removal of our greenhouse gas emission. This is really important because we need to be practical. We need to make sure that we have the proper budget, that we can actually monetize it and further explain to the board the importance of climate change in our operation. So looking at our strategy, which is the second pillar of the CFD, we look to make sure that we reduce our climate change impact, and we do this by setting short-term, medium-term, and long-term target. We need to promote climate change action plan and practices through innovation, improve efficiency, and support actions throughout our operations, and to increase the resilience of our business by managing the risks and opportunities by looking at forecasting climate scenarios for our climate impact evaluation, and incorporating what we call our 7 R's of circularity. And this is very much involved in looking at the main risks that our business face. For example, in our case, it would be sea level rising and heat, as well as flood. These are the impacts that we are looking at, and we have undertaken a physical risk analysis on all our operations to identify specifically what kind of risk and at what percentage our risk, the risk that we are facing at different parts of the operation. So this is looking at practically implementing what are the actions that we require in terms of managing our risks and our opportunities. In looking at further our strategy, the 7 R's of circularity here is the first thing is to rethink. And this is the part that is really important. This is about the cultural change of the whole business. In other words, we look into our people, our internal stakeholders, to have a rethink of what climate change is to our operation, and then to look at parts of repurposing, parts of our waste, looking at reducing, reusing, repairing, recycling, and recovering. This is the 7 R's of circularity that permeates from the plantation down to the manufacturing. We also look to undertake precision agriculture in order for us to look into making sure that use of fertilizer is maximized or optimized, and making sure that we understand areas in which we need to focus in terms of our agricultural needs and best practices. Regenerative agriculture is another strategy that the plantations are looking into to make sure that we have lessened our impact to the global, to the planet. Finally, when you look at the third pillar of TCFD, this is where we have our short-term, medium-term, and long-term strategy. So for short-term, we have benchmarked against a 2015 carbon intensity, a reduction of 40% by 2025 for scopes 1 and 2. And this is specifically on our operation. And looking at this almost like this is already our seventh, going to be our 7th year. We can say that right now we are really on target to reduce. We are actually right now about 31% in 2023. And we look to make sure that by 2025, we meet a 40% reduction. So we are, all the actions that we have actually put into place are actually meeting this target. At a medium term, we are looking to be carbon neutral for scopes 1 and 2 by 2030. And this is really important because one of the things that we also look at is the business impact of, say, for example, the carbon tax that probably will be implemented to all our export markets. And therefore, it is important for us to make sure that we ourselves are carbon neutral by 2030. And the long term, the net zero that we are achieving, we are trying to achieve is by 2040, not 2050, but 2040. We feel that we are able to do it simply because of the fact that we have a lot of conservation areas that can commit to sequestration. We also believe that technology would be, matured enough to address some of the issues of renewable energy, and also to partner with our suppliers to help them towards the journey to reduce GHG emission. So I think this is the main theme that I wanted to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Serena. It is a very comprehensive climate governance model and climate action plan that you have in place, and you've come quite a long way on your sustainability journey. I see that you've got the longer term target is the scope 3 emissions. That generally is the more challenging part. Do you find also in your industry that with your supply chains, it is the most difficult part to manage?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we feel quite confident in being able to reduce our emission reduction for scopes 1 and 2, our own operation by 2030, simply because of the fact that we have put in place a lot of efforts, like, for example, best practices, protection of set-aside forests, implementing waste management. We adopted regenerative agriculture as mentioned. But when you look at our supply chain, then it becomes very important for us to bring them along in our journey. And we have started that by working with our suppliers. The first thing is awareness of the impact of of them being, to reduce their greenhouse gas emission. Because as our suppliers, we look into giving them understanding of the impact to their business if they don't reduce their greenhouse gas emission. In other words, we would give preferential treatment, for example, to suppliers that are together on our journey towards net zero. And we would like to also share with them our best management practice in terms of managing greenhouse gas, creating awareness and capacity building. So this part is the most difficult part. We need to influence our suppliers to understand that it is not going to go away. As the first speaker stated, if you are along with the journey together now, we would be able to get the benefit earlier. So this is what we are imparting to our suppliers, that listen, guys, you need to come along and understand this is an important part of our business. To be able to supply to us, you need to be on board, and we will not leave you by yourself. We will help you by, as I said, sharing our best management practices, helping them to calculate greenhouse gas emission. What are the parameters that they need to look at in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emission? So these are practicalities that you have to look into first, because first and foremost, mindset change needs to come in, and after that you have to offer them practical help in order for them to achieve this net zero target.
Seems to be very many stakeholders to manage, as well as the internal decisions that needs to be made. So a very big challenge for organizations, which you seem to be well in the way of managing. We are going to move on to our next topic, but before I do that, I just want to remind our audience that we will be having a live Q&A later, so you can submit your questions via the Q&A button below. We talked earlier a little bit about greenwashing and green hushing, but of course there are very real litigation implications and legal implications around the setting of targets, around climate action, shareholder activism that's become much more prominent. And within that, board directors do have a fiduciary duty to manage the potential risks and threats of companies. So with shareholder activism and also the fact that there's a lot more scrutiny on boards these days, this threat has become quite real. So Tracy, does the failure to act where information is generally available, or even if it's a failure to properly disclose the potential impact, expose directors to legal action?
Absolutely. And it's not a hypothetical situation either. Over the last kind of decade maybe, but escalating at a rapid rate, the number of litigation, the number of cases, the amount of litigation relating to sustainability and climate change and greenwashing has really dramatically increased. There are thousands of cases that have been brought or that are currently making their way through the courts around the world. There is a project, for example, called the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative, which examines its sole reason for existing is to examine the legal basis for directors and trustees to consider, manage, and report on climate change and other sustainability issues and risks and opportunities, and to examine the circumstances in which there may be liability for them failing to do so. There are, honestly, so many cases around greenwashing and green hushing, cases brought against companies for saying that they are doing things when they are not doing those things, litigation brought against corporations for damages for climate impacts. That's kind of quite a common one. There's an interesting case at the moment with where a farmer in Peru has instituted litigation against a German electricity utility on the basis that utility is one of the reasons why the glacier, which threatens that farmer's town, is melting. And so he is suing a massive German utility for damages related to the risks faced by the town. At a more personal level, earlier this year, an NGO in the UK, an environmental legal NGO called Client Earth, together with a large group of institutional investors, instigated the world's first derivative action against the board of directors of Shell, alleging mismanagement of climate risk and alleging that that is a breach of company law. So in short, the risks are large and growing. The fact that there hasn't been, you might argue, well, no director, no board of directors or individual director has been found to be liable or has been held liable for failure to report on climate risk or sustainability risk, or for misleading shareholders in relation to sustainability risk, means that it's not too much of a risk. But you must remember that this is a really, it's a developing area of the law, and it's developing fast, and it's developing globally. And every case that is finalized in any jurisdiction is scrutinized in every other jurisdiction for its potential to set precedent in that country. So I think that this is, I think it's a significant risk. And, you know, what Paul was talking about in terms of looking forward, looking at the risks for board, audit and risk committees to be really focusing on the potential for the focus to land on them, because every company is exposed to climate risks. Every company is potentially going to be the target of this kind of litigation and activism. And you must also remember that in a world where corporate profitability, as Paul also mentioned, is going to be increasingly connected to and linked to a company's sustainability performance, shareholders will be basing investment decisions on what a company is saying about its sustainability credentials and its targets and plans in terms of climate change and other ESG risks. And if it's found that investment decisions were based on information provided by the company that turns out to be misleading or fraudulent, then that is going to potentially form the foundation for shareholder action against management and against corporations in the future. So I think there's a whole raft of potential legal risks here that have only, you know, corporate boards have only really touched the surface of understanding the potential risks here.
Would you say, though, that the litigation risks would also depend on the legal frameworks in countries or the governance codes in countries?
Yes, absolutely. But that's the interesting aspect of the CCLI project, which is examine the legal basis for director liability for climate risk mismanagement, to kind of summarize what it's about, in 5 or 6 jurisdictions so far. Now, they are all Commonwealth law-based jurisdictions, so obviously they share some similarities in their legal frameworks. But there are, you know, there are a number of similarities, and they've found potential bases for liability in all of those jurisdictions. I think that one of the, you know, we have a global economic system, and to a certain extent, we have global corporate governance expectations, and corporate law is, of course, distinct and different in different countries, but because the global economy is so interlinked, there are a huge number of similarities in corporate governance expectations and corporate governance legal frameworks. And so I suspect there will be not many jurisdictions where it's found to be completely impossible to, we're talking about fiduciary duties here. That at its core, what we're talking about is a fiduciary duty, right? Which is a very old concept, even if it's being used and applied to a very new problem. And so, you know, lawyers are creative, and activist lawyers, climate activist lawyers are particularly creative. And so, you know, in the same way as there's first mover advantage for companies managing climate risk in proactive and progressive ways, there's first mover advantage for lawyers bringing successful cases in this regard. So there's a race on across the globe to be, you know, the first case that has a significant impact on corporate liability for climate impacts.
Thanks, Tracy. Scary thought for organizations, but also great for the general sentiment to be followed. I think organizations are a lot more clear in terms of where they need to be going with the sustainability agenda, what the pros and the cons are. Thank you for sharing that with us. Before we move on to our next topic, we'll take a 3-minute break. And if you want to ask any more questions from our panelists, please submit it via the Q&A window in the Zoom. Thank you.
This is Bob, and he's from ABC Company, the chairperson for today's AGM. And this is AGM at Convene, his easy and painless one-stop solution platform to conduct a seamless virtual AGM experience. The AGM at Convene admin portal is where everything happens. Bob can broadcast his live AGM proceedings.
Okay, welcome back to our webinar. We've had some very interesting insights that's been shared by our panelists. And I just want to briefly touch on what is known as the concept of shared value and what they call circular models, which is what companies have adopted to return to the environment more than they actually take from it. And by circulating products and waste materials, eliminating waste, regenerating nature, which is something that Dr. Serena has already touched on. Waini, can you perhaps just very briefly share with us some of the innovative projects that you have implemented in your organization?
Thank you, Zara. This gives me, oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. So innovation is, I think, one of the best things out of this sustainability journey is just the potential, the huge potential for innovation. And part of what drives us is seeing something new. So in Bamburi, as I spoke, we have had quite a number of challenges. We've innovated in several ways. So one is something we are calling greener cements. And these are cement products that have up to 30% less carbon footprint. As I spoke about, we launched this in November last year, on 18th of November. We're quite happy and quite excited. We've all talked about the impact of Scope 1 emissions, and we have to actively take the lead in reducing Scope 1 emissions. And part of that involves producing cement in a more sustainable way. So the cement products we launched, we have 4 cement products. We have a plastering cement, normal construction cement, and a cement for marine environments, which have 30% less carbon footprint, and we launched an eco-label. The second thing we've done is we've innovated in terms of building and construction. So in Kenya, we currently have the first housing development out of 3D printing, which is exciting and fantastic for us. So we have a housing project in Kilifi County, somewhere down at the coastal side of Kenya, for those of you who know the map of the country. And we have a building for residential purposes that has been constructed on 3D printing. This is fantastic. Fast 3D printing uses less, it just uses less product, less cement, or maybe not less cement, but less water. The construction time is less as well. So in about a month, you have maybe constructed 3 or 4 houses, which you do in 6 or 7 months. So it's quite phenomenal for us. We will be launching that in about 2 months and opening them up for the general public. And the other area we've had to innovate in addition to those, are just things to do with alternative fuels for use. So most likely, we've spoken about the impact of coal on the global economy and of course the emissions, and how companies and countries have found it difficult to let go of coal. So in our industry, coal is one of the energy sources that drive our kilns. Now, coal, of course, it's a fossil fuel. It has very high carbon emissions. And because of that, we've had to look at alternatives. What do these alternatives look like? We are looking at alternatives in the form of biomass. So rice husks, coffee husks, things that you would consider waste. We build circularity into the economy. We use those in the kilns. We are looking at waste oil. So we are partnering with the petroleum industry to use what is considered waste oil and what would damage the environment as part of fuel. And as we use that, we then, of course, also build that circularity. Additionally, we've also looked at tires. So A number of us drive. Those who drive have vehicles. You need to change your tires once in a while. You wonder what happens to them after you've changed them. So we have partnered also with various organizations to try and use those as fuel. Now, these are just innovations that help to reduce our carbon footprint. I apologize, there may be some background noise in my area. And the last thing I wanted to speak about was solar. So energy cost in Kenya is very high. As of last year, between last year and this year, we had about 30% increase in the cost of power. This is huge. In one quarter, it was 15% increase. So all targets, you can imagine, you still need to deliver the business targets, but you're now faced with a sudden increase in Q4 of 15% cost of energy and electrical energy. So we are now in the process of building a solar power plant. So we will put up solar in 2 of our plants in Mombasa and in Athi River to power 30% of our operations.
Thanks, Wayne. It's really very encouraging to see all the initiatives that governments are following, and certainly all the green projects that's coming out of business. We've heard from or seen from Dr. Serena's presentation as well that there's a lot going on in IOI group. So it's really very encouraging to see that. I just want to, we're running out of time, there's so much to talk about, but touch on the digitalization aspect in terms of sustainability. And some of the research that's been done has shown a link between digital capabilities and sustainability. And there has been some reports that companies that are successful in their digital transformation are almost twice as likely to see ESG goals as a key focus. Shagun, can you maybe share with us how can digital technology advance the sustainability initiatives of organizations?
Great, thank you, Zara. Please excuse me if my voice is a little shaky and stuff. I'm a little under the weather, but I hope you can hear me clearly. Good morning, good afternoon, probably now good evening to some people, probably wherever they are right now. Basically around the technology, I mean, how can digital technology advance the sustainability initiative of organizations? I think it's been very insightful attending this session. I mean, considering that Africa's contribution to global warming is 3%, I mean, where we're headed, I mean, it's pretty scary. And I think it puts us in a very, very effective position for us to prepare ourselves very quickly on making sure that we don't, step into some of the areas that some of the other countries have actually. So when we look at this is for companies willing to think broadly about how to advance their sustainability initiatives. Technology can act as a major accelerant. Now, we call this mindset as technology eco-advantage, using advanced technologies and ways of working to enable profitable solutions that also have a positive impact on net zero and other ESG goals. Now, the combination of process automation, carbon data transparency, circular product or service design. And when we talk about circular, we also talk about digital product and sustainable business models can reduce emission by 45 to almost 70%. Now, if we talk about, and I'm going to purely talk about the East African or the Ugandan, although there's been very interesting discussions by my colleague here, with Wayne, Wayne, I don't intend to underplay the drought that we've been going through, but I mean, from Uganda's perspective, we've been a little luckier when it comes to the drought. So if we look at the process automation perspective, I think one of the key things from a policy point of view that has been a challenge from our end is government or businesses not having clarity on whether they can look at cloud native architecture, because we're not sure whether data on the cloud or data on-prem is something that we can very easily, although this is something that's being worked on and it's beginning to open up. But this has been a major challenge, and now we've beginning to get some movement around the cloud native architecture. So a lot of process automation is beginning to happen within the East African region, especially from a government point of view. So there are two key things, which is cloud-based data and digital platforms that are beginning to open up. AI-driven cost and emission optimization. This is a very key thing to talk about because initially technology for the East Africa or overall for Africa had been a very expensive undertaking. Whether we're looking at a digital ERP or we're looking at a digital HR platform, it was a heavy undertaking. And now the beauty is that majority of the technology companies have come out with something called the no-code, low-code platform, which basically allows you now to create technology based specifically on what you want to utilize. And it doesn't need to be the entire. So for example, like when we were talking about the growth of palm oil, if there was a specific app that was supposed to be created of monitoring or even IoT on monitoring the growth of the palm trees, we could create a specific application and at a very low cost by doing that. Secondly, we're talking about carbon data transparency. Inside the carbon data transparency, we're now beginning to see a lot of movement around the IoT and the blockchain tracking solutions. And we're also looking at data visualization and impact reporting. One of the biggest problems around reporting has been, or data visualization, is that if board members are looking at a report, the data that is being put together has been put by different departments and taken a lot of time and effort to put that together. But if we have a central system that can present that to the board to be able to visualize whether we're looking at performance from a financial perspective, whether we're looking at it from a sales point of view, whether we're looking at it from an impact point of view, we're able to see that from a central perspective, and that's becoming quite something that's available easily. The other thing is digital products and services. When we look at digital products and services, we're seeing human-centered design and digital products. Exactly what I'd mentioned earlier, that if we want to create now applications that are very centric to what the business wants to look at, we are able to do that at a very low cost. The other thing is the behavioral analytics. The fourth thing is the data ecosystem and ventures. So we have cross-industry sector data partnerships for joint abatement initiatives across the ecosystem. So we have data sharing and ecosystems, and we also have cyber resilience. Now, on these couple of levers that I've actually spoken about, I can actually give you some use cases that might be of value. A simple thing would be like digital operations. Create more sustainable operations and processes that win stakeholders' preference, because industry standards, become industry standards or improve business resilience. An example is innovative textile dyeing technology that reduces water, energy, and chemical used and pollutants generated. That's an example that we're looking at. Digital product and services, creating new digital channels, that break economic constraints to expand reach, scale, and access for societal impact at affordable costs. And an example would be customer-centric sustainability solutions that reimagine how parcels are delivered through reducing emissions. Now, there are a couple of examples that I can talk about, and there's certain things that I made note of while I was listening to the session. And there was something that Paul had mentioned about that was basically review learning. As much as that the board members are, or the board is looking at a digital platform, or is looking at sharing information on a digital platform, I think there needs to be consistent learning that needs to happen, and there needs to be development plans that need to be looked at. So I think these are some of the things that Zara, I could share. There are more examples, but I think I'll pause here, considering that there is a time constraint here.
Thanks so much again. I think data has become a really critical commodity for businesses and governments, and to facilitate effective and efficient decision making, it's going to become even more critical. So digitalization is definitely going to be the way to go. And I'm really glad that you mentioned quite a few times low cost and affordable, because I think that's one of the issues that organizations are always, that would be a deterrent when they think about digitalization, is the cost of that. So, but thank you for sharing that with us. We have unfortunately come to the end, and it doesn't seem like we're going to have time to look at the questions, but we will definitely respond to that on the website. So thank you for those who have sent us in some questions. Thank you very much to our panel today for sharing your insights with us. I think the issues that we've tackled today, that organizations are facing, such as the investment that is required generally for sustainability, the fact that in some countries the journey is probably going to take a little bit longer because the situation is different, as we've heard from Jack in Hong Kong. There is also the positive sides that we've seen from Wayne and Dr. Serena, and the circular models that's been adopted, where organizations are actually giving back to the environment, and also using clean energy, the green funding that has been made available. It is going to be a journey, and for some it's going to be longer than others. But I think the other point that is quite clear is that it is not something that can be done in isolation. We do need governments to work with business, to work with the community. And it's really fantastic to see that these initiatives are starting to materialize in so many countries. So I think we will just, I'm just going to be wrapping up the session now. And I just would like to take this opportunity to thank all the role players who've made this event possible. And I must give a special thanks to our excellent panelists, Naini, Tracy, Dr. Serena, Paul, Jack, and Shikun. Thank you very much for your insights. Also, a special thank you to everyone at Convene. It's really been an absolute pleasure to work with a team that's as professional as you are, and efficiency. Thank you to our CSIA EXCO members for their contributions and support. And of course, a huge thank you to our audience for joining us today. Thank you for your questions. That adds value and new perspective to our discussions. And I trust that you will leave here today not only with the broader knowledge, but also inspired and motivated to take this back to your organizations and improve your or practice and promote good governance. For our attendees, we will be posting the full webinar video on our website. So it will be www.aziasconvene.com. It will also be on the CSIA website, which is csiaorg.com. You can also follow Convene on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook, as well as CSIA. If you want to know more about the products from Convene, you also may contact the sales team at sales@azizconvene.com. For more information on CSIA, please visit our website at csia.org. It's been an absolute pleasure to moderate the event today. We just never really have enough time to look at all the issues and discuss everything. But I look forward to having you join us for our next webinars, and we will continue to explore relevant and thought-provoking topics on this dynamic world of corporate governance. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar, Corporate Secretary Setting the Sustainability Agenda. And on behalf of CSIA Convene and our panelists, wish you everything of the best. Thanks and goodbye.